The story goes that at the end of Baudelaire's life, after 47 years of just absolute vice and misery, when he finally died of, I think it was a heart attack, his mother, a long-suffering woman that she was, didn't state that she wished he had never bankrupted the family. She didn't wish that he had never contracted syphilis. She didn't wish that he'd never started taking laudanum. She wished that he had never written a line of verse. And even assuming that she knew in that moment the kind of contribution that he had made to French letters, to world letters, I keep more and more, I'm starting to think she might have had a point. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. That name might be a mistake. So I help out with a poetry magazine, a literary magazine, which for the time being will stay nameless just in case they want to disown me when this comes out. But we sent some review copies of some new poetry collections to a guy who's written some stuff for us. And it had been a little while since we heard from him, so I wrote him the other day and just checked in. Hey, what about those books you read? What did you like? What do you think? What do you want to review? And he wrote back a very polite note saying, I don't really want to review any of them. I didn't like any of them. I haven't liked much poetry anytime recently. I offered to send him some other stuff. And, his final response was that it just, all poetry in general feels so far away from him and really brings him no pleasure these days. And his stomach really is turned on it as a whole. And this is a guy who's won several big deal poetry prizes. He's a Stegner Fellow, a Lilly Fellow. Published a book of poems not long ago after winning a prize. Has every reason and more, far more than I do even, to like poetry. And when I heard him say this, my honest immediate response was, oh my God, I know exactly what you're talking about. Of course, because poetry's the worst. It's terrible. And the odd thing about this, so in order to like poetry, in order to be the kind of person who is into poetry beyond, elementary school and maybe even then, you are you have to be just a nut. I mean, if you were to write a biography of a poet, an honest biography of your average poet, and you just substituted into the biography the word heroine for poetry or poems, there would be very little difference, very little inconsistency in terms of failure, humiliation, disappointment, relationship to family, friends, marriages. Poetry is terrible for you, and it ruins lives, and it's hard to encourage kids to turn to it. I mean, more seriously though, it's a thing I've noticed among my friends and peers, my wife, me, people who've really devoted themselves to poetry for decades have just begun to lose any taste for it. And this is where my heroin comparison really falls apart, because people quit heroin, but not because they lost the taste for it. it's a bizarre thing, and it's something I don't know how to account for exactly. But hearing this from our would-be reviewer gave me a little bit of cheer, encouragement, or at least made me want to try to answer this question. And this is part of what I'm, I guess, setting out to do with this silly little podcast. Apart from provide an audio recording in real time of midlife crisis, which is pretty much what half the podcasts out there are doing anyway. But I thought I wanted to see if I could answer this question: what the fuck is going on? Why have I lost so much of my taste for it, and my wife and my friends and this guy, when it ought to be, it has been, at the center of our lives for quite a long time. Now, I want to head off right here an obvious suggestion that I imagine some of you might be just itching to bring up, and that is Ben Lerner's book, The Hatred of Poetry, which was published a few years ago. Let's see, what's the copyright? It's published in 2016. And it was, this is Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and was published with great acclaim. He's, of course, a very celebrated poet and writer of fiction, who may, in some ways seems to have had his own turning away from the art forms. He seems not to be going back to much poetry after having turned to, autobiographical fiction. But this is a terrible and stupid book. He's a very, very smart guy and a very talented writer. And this book, The Hatred of Poetry, is just dog shit. Just terrible. I've already written about it at some length, and so I don't want to get into it too much here. But, the basic argument of this book is that it's twofold. One, I, Ben Lerner, have a sort of a rage and a hatred toward poetry because I imagine that it could be a perfect thing, and in fact, in practice, it's always a bad, fallen, dirty, failed thing. And the second part of this argument is that also everybody, not just poets, is exactly like me, which, the whole thing just reads to me a little bit like a very eloquent toddler's reckoning with object permanence. I have the cake. I can't eat the cake and still have it. If I cover my face, am I still here? So, I just want to set that aside and say The Hatred of Poetry is something to talk about. Again, I'll see if I can provide a link in the show notes to something I wrote about it a while ago. But that's not quite what I'm talking about here. And, the simplest proof of that, the simplest proof of the difference, is that individual, actual poems, even by, what he would call great poets, I would as well, are the things that most infuriate Ben Lerner and most set off this hatred of poetry. And in fact, the only poetry that would not inspire this feeling is poetry in heaven, ideal poetry, is some kind of Platonic vision that has nothing to do with actual words and actual speakers and actual brains and feelings and people. So for me, though, I find that the only real effective antidote to the malaise, to use our reviewer's word, is reading an actual poem that's actually good. And I want to come back to that at the end of this episode, because the truth is that I still read and write some and edit poetry and care about it in a way that isn't quite, it's not quite the way you care about your drug habit. It's not quite the way you care about your religion. So maybe, it's a little bit like maybe I was raised devoutly Catholic and don't believe in God anymore. And, there's a little bit of nostalgia. So maybe that's part of it, but that doesn't seem quite right either. So the goal here, though, is that rather than just try to figure all this shit out myself, I wanted to try out some things. Talking through this with luck, doing so with some friends and acquaintances, and maybe even enemies on this funny little project with a just ridiculous name. So I want to get to all of that in good time, but today I want to focus on a much smarter essay than Ben Lerner's, an essay published in the New Criterion for National Poetry Month by Adam Kirsch. It's called On Getting Poetry. Quick word on National Poetry Month, which is a silly holiday, but more so on the New Criterion, which is a weird magazine. It's a monthly culture and politics commentary magazine that it's broadly conservative and publishes some very anodyne, commonsensical commentary, a lot of sort of noxious and horrifying, right-wing commentary, and then it also publishes some pretty decent poetry and some pretty decent poetry criticism. So it's a weird thing. It's not. There is an uneasy alliance between conservative politics and what we call formal poetry today that almost every formal poet I know is uncomfortable with, but it's hard to cut yourself entirely free from it. I don't really want to get into politics a whole lot in this podcast, but I don't sympathize with the overwhelming majority of what the New Criterion has to say about this stuff. I just think that they have some good commentary on poetry. I'm not even talking about William Logan's, though I think I do want to take some time to talk about Logan later on another episode. Today, though, I want to get to Adam Kirsch's essay On Getting Poetry, which I think is a pretty good title, and it's a pretty good essay. I think it's not quite right all the way through, but it's he's a smart and thoughtful guy and a terrific poet, and I want to pull it apart a little bit. So we'll do that right after a very short break. So the Adam Kirsch piece is called On Getting Poetry, which is, as I said, I think is it's a good title because partly because it's very plain spoken, but also it gets at the experience of poetry, or the frustrating lack of experience of poetry that people might have in feeling like they don't get it. So I have a special fondness for, and even bias for essays on poetry that start at the beginning. I almost feel like every good book or essay about poetry should be basically an introduction to poetry. This essay, I'm only going to talk about certain parts of it because some of it's so introductory, but it reminds me a little bit of another very good introductory essay on poetry called How to Think Like a Poet by Ryan Wilson, who's a friend, I should say, as probably goes without saying, that it's such a fucking small world, poetry, especially certain corners of it, that, it's chances are pretty good that any given name I mention, if it's somebody alive and in America, or even not in some cases, maybe somebody I know. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, which you probably were anyway. So, on Getting Poetry, Kirsch begins with, I'll just read from the opening paragraph. A subscriber to this magazine writes with a problem. Although I have advanced university degrees, I have never gotten poetry. He's not alone. I hear the same thing regularly from people who love to read novels and biographies, who are undaunted by string quartets and abstract paintings, but find poetry a closed door. No one is more aware of this disconnect between poetry and the reading public than poets themselves. The debate over why poetry moved from the center of literary culture to the outskirts of the academy and how it can regain its place in the sun has been going on at least since Dana Gioia's landmark essay, Can Poetry Matter?, appeared in The Atlantic in 1991. And he, more recently, the poet and novelist Ben Lerner devoted a short book to explaining the hatred of poetry, The Poet Critic. Stephanie Burt, perhaps taking that hatred for granted, titled a book about how to read poems, Don't Read Poetry. All right, so he's starting out from this basic question of that I think many people have, and I think it's partly a result of the fact that poetry is so poorly taught in elementary school, and part of me wishes that it were. I think in some ways it may be better not to teach it at all than to teach it the way that it's taught today. And this, Kirsch does make this point that poetry, as he puts it, it's taught as if it were the vegetables, when really it should be the dessert. But of course, you can't really teach dessert in school. Here, I'll read a little bit later on. He makes this argument that I think is understandable and is partly true, but sort of misses a big point. So he's talking about how fewer and fewer people are coming to poetry as a popular art form, he says basically that Philip Larkin made this observation, and you can make the same observation today, where, with fiction and music, people buy it, though he may not be paying attention to the book market for fiction these days. Whereas the Poetry Foundation, with its $200 million endowment, looks for ways to control people into reading poems. The Poetry Foundation, by the way, which, God love them, they do a terrible job, just terrible. Just how could you spend that money less effectively? But so to get back to Kirsch, after he gives a jab to the Poetry Foundation, there he says, but the comparison isn't entirely fair. Yes, poetry is meant to give pleasure. In his preface to Lyrical Ballads in 1802, Wordsworth said that the poet pays homage to the great elementary principle of pleasure, by which he knows and feels and lives and moves. And this is Kirsch again. But like many adult pleasures, poetry is an acquired taste. We don't grow up surrounded by it the way we do with pop music and movies, whose conventions become second nature. Rather, poetry is to our usual ways of reading and writing as classical music is to pop, or as ballet is to dancing at parties. The medium is the same, language, sound, and movement, respectively, but the conventions and values are very different and require some effort to get used to. What's more, the history of English poetry stretches back 700 years, give or take, so reading some of the greatest poems means coming to grips with ways of thinking and uses of language that are opaque to a 21st century American reader. Okay, so this is true as far as it goes. You do need, I guess part of the point he's making is that, where ballet and classical music were once popular music, even if for only, only a certain slice of the population, that was once popular culture. They're not anymore. And so in order to appreciate them, we have to sort of become amateur historians as well and kind of re-immerse ourselves in that, I guess what philosophers call the hermeneutic circle, imagining ourselves into the past in which one might read this with pleasure or take this in with pleasure. And that, that there's truth to that. But it also seems to me that there's a kind of a key point that he's sort of eliding, or he's there's a little bit of a sleight of hand here, because poetry is an acquired taste in that you have to acquire a taste for it. But unlike beer, say, or hot sauce, it remains acquired, right? Which is to say, it's not hard necessarily to read a very elementary poem today, Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. But to the extent to which poetry is an acquired taste, I guess is what I would say, you have to keep acquiring it. For the most part, actually acquired taste. Horror movies are an acquired taste. It's pretty hard to watch one until you get used to it. As I said, there are other foods and drinks that are acquired taste. Coffee is an acquired taste, but once you've acquired it, it's second nature. And I'm not sure poetry ever quite is, or at least it's not the same way that a pop song or a piece of music in general, or a movie is. I've acquired poetry as a taste about as well as one could, but there's it is not immediate in the same way that some other what we call pop culture today is. I don't know if that's because pop culture is changing or technology changes, but I think the comparison that comes to mind, as gross and awful as it is that is the comparison to sex versus masturbation, right? That there's one is clearly easier and readier to access than the other, but what's also true is that there's a very different kind of satisfaction that comes with one and the other. And that satisfaction, the deeper satisfaction, joy, you might talk about the joy of sex. You probably don't talk often about the joy of masturbation. And that's because there's, an investment and a care. And I also don't buy that it's just a matter of being harder, right? I don't think it's just that, I hiked up the mountain, so now that Coke tastes extra good. I think there's just something else there. I don't have the answer, but I think that there's something Kirsch senses and is slipping over. And maybe that's fine for an introductory essay. So we can move on from there. He does offer a distinction that I just find to be silly, which is that he talks about Rupi Kaur, who's a famous Insta poet, maybe, as he mentions, maybe the most famous poet in the world right now. Certainly her book of poems, Milk and Honey, is just fabulously successful. And she's got a huge presence online. And her poems are fine. They don't do anything of any interest to anybody I know who cares about poetry, but I don't begrudge her fans their enjoyment of her. Setting aside questions of like Instagram being kind of a lifestyle promoting medium, the distinction that Kirsch offers is that we should he says it's not right to say that Rupi Kaur and the other Insta poets aren't poets, or what they write is not poetry. He says rather we should say that what they write is poetry, and what, say, Wallace Stevens writes is art poetry. He says it's more useful to distinguish between art poetry and other kinds of writing that go under the name of poetry, just as music distinguishes between art songs and popular or folk songs. And that feels silly to me, partly because I don't want to use the term art poetry, but also partly because while we might use a term like art house cinema, what Tarkovsky and Bergman and Fellini made is movies. And what Michael Bay makes, and Steven Spielberg, and Eli Roth, they also make movies. And we don't have that big a problem being able to separate those. Instead, it feels like art poetry as a label feels to me a little bit like a note from your mom excusing you from gym. That if we call it art poetry, then it's okay that it fails. I'll talk a little later about what I mean by fails. But let's keep going through this essay. So there is, I think, a really wonderful section late in the essay where Kirsch talks about a problem of contrast. And it's something I've thought a lot about, and surely other people have written about it and talked about it. But I think he puts it in pretty helpfully concise terms. So, from late in the essay. In the 20th century, however, the dialectical evolution of poetic styles gave way to a more dramatic and irreparable kind of breach. So he was talking about he has actually a good and very long section about form and content and tensions between form and content. And it's nothing new necessarily, but it's very well put and well done. And I recommend the essay to anybody. It's a smart essay. But let's go back to the end. In the 20th century, however, the dialectical evolution of poetic styles gave way to a more dramatic and irreparable kind of breach. With modernism and postmodernism, each of the arts turned against what had long been considered its defining technique. Just as composers rejected tonality and painters rejected representation, poets stopped writing in verse. the regular patterns of rhythm and rhyme that had been the essence of poetry in every culture since ancient times. In each genre, this rejection was initially experienced as a liberation that made new kinds of beauty possible. The first generation of modernists and their audiences knew the conventions that were being dispensed with, so they could appreciate the extent and purpose of the transgression. I thought this is just exactly right. It made me think of an experience I've had a number of times in museums. If you go to a museum with a good range of art from different periods, you can sort of experience it in a sort, roughly in order. You go from classical art or even ancient Egyptian art, ancient Indian art, into the little remains from the Dark Ages, depending on what part of the world you're looking at, medieval art, Renaissance art. You see not a progression exactly. I think as plenty of other people have pointed out, I don't think progress is quite is a term that quite makes sense in application to art, but there is a tradition, right? Eliot talks about in his tradition of the individual talent, every new major contribution to the tradition reorders all of those works that preceded it. Borges, in an essay, Kafka and his Precursors, I think is how it's translated. I say that not because I'm brilliant and speak Spanish fluently, but because I just think that's the translation I read. In his essay, Kafka and his Precursors, says that in typical Borgesian style, that Kafka or any great artist actually invents his predecessors or his precursors. I can't fucking remember now. The qualities that existed in those earlier writers or earlier artists didn't actually exist in them until the later genius came around to bring them out. If you walk through a museum in this way, you get to the Renaissance, you get to the Baroque period, you get finally into the Modernists, and even the different degrees of modernism. From something like Dali, surrealism, the Chirico, to into the genuine abstract expressionists or the minimalists. I came upon, it wasn't Malevich's White on White, but it was some other basically all white painting in some museum. And I think because I had come to it after having seen paintings and sculptures that preceded it in time, if not always in some notion of progress, it can be really moving. I don't dismiss minimalist or self-styled experiments, a different question, but the imagism, the deeply broken free verse of someone like William Carlos Williams. But what I think Kirsch gets just exactly right is that much of the power of this stuff comes from its immediate juxtaposition with the much more metrically, formally traditional work that came before it. So when you see that strict iambic pentameter and rhyme, say, is an option, then breaking from that is startling, can be bracing, can be exciting. I do think there's a little bit of there's a middle step. I think of what I call vers libre, or think of as vers libre, free verse in French, literally. But that's that is something like Dover Beach or Proof Rock, or even I am just a fucking sucker for certain sentimental poems. I think of A Farewell by Coventry Patmore. These are poems that have rhyme and they have meter, but neither is regular. And in Patmore's poem, if I recall, he even ends on an unrhymed line, which is sort of wonderful because it's about a breakup. So there are people who do something like this today. I think Aaron Pachigian has done that pretty nicely with some of his Sappho translations. There's I think it was A. Stallings observed, at least in my presence, that doggerel as a term, once was a little bit more specific in its application. It didn't just mean shitty poetry, but it meant specifically rhyme without meter, which is something you see, from people here and then. Brian Wilson's Will Sonnets have it. I hate the name Will Sonnets, though I really like some of those poems. Yeah, that's unfortunate. Great poems. Don't stop saying Will Sonnets. It doesn't make sense. Every podcast should have a beef, so I guess I'm starting my first beef here. Oh, I guess I already started with... Well, anyway. So I think that Kirsch makes a really good point here, and he goes on, and he kind of completes the thought. The difficult glory of high modernism lasted about a generation, say from 1910 to 1940. But once modernism itself became the canon, artists and audiences gradually lost the ability to extend or even fully appreciate its achievements, because they never mastered the conventions that modernism overthrew. This great de-skilling, combined with the rise of mass media and the democratization of culture, resulted in a fracturing of the arts after World War II. In different ways, music, painting, and poetry each split in two: a cerebral avant-garde version devoted to extending the modernist experiment, and a popular version that appealed to mass audiences without knowledge of the art's tradition and conventions. So he makes the distinction. He actually fudges this a little bit, because he later brings in a third category. But basically, he says that there are three, in the new era, there's sort of three types of poets. You can be a popular poet, which is to say either a Rupi Kaur style insta poet, or even more popularly, a singer-songwriter or rapper. Really, I think rap is where a lot of the tradition of pride and virtuosity and wordplay, meter, rhyme. Who brags about being good at rhyming anymore? The Renaissance poets used to, but today it's rappers. Rappers, are the ones who make that boast. But he says basically you can either be a popular poet, and in that case you get an audience, but you lose a certain degree of prestige, and maybe he also says basically sort of what you're making is ultimately a little bit slighter, lesser than it would have been in another era. It's a shaky claim. And then, but that's one category. There's popular poets, and then the academic poets, and he smushes together a couple of concepts here. He says there are these poets who've retreated to the academy. That's certainly true. To continue the tradition of high modernism, which almost feels like a contradiction in terms. But this basically suggests that there are the devoted avant-gardists and post-avant-gardists, and now sort of post-avant-gardists, and they retreated to the academy to impress each other with their work and to be read by nobody. He then does, at the very end of the essay, after giving what feels kind of like a little bit of a silly concession to nonsense poetry, high nonsense, but the best of nonsense poetry. He calls out John Ashbery and says basically, hey, everybody liked John Ashbery, and it's easy for anyone to read. He says a really bizarre statement. He says, even a difficult poet is more accessible to the common reader than a serialist composer is to the common concert goer. That seems not true at all. And he quotes from a John Ashbery poem. Maybe part of his point is by quoting from the poem, which is really even more than the average Ashbery poem. It's sort of it's a piece of nonsense, artful, stylish, sexy nonsense, but nonsense. Maybe his point is that read this and you can see that I only halfway mean what I'm saying. But after this concession, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, he concludes by he's tipped his hat to Ashbery, and then he performs, I think, an understandable institutional genuflection to the new criterion. But he introduces basically his third secret category of contemporary poets, which is you have the popular poets, you have the academic poets, who are, almost by definition, the sort of avant-gardists, and then you have, the new criterion offers a home for poets who aspire to work in that tradition, this being the tradition of Milton, Pope, and Hopkins. And our correspondent is already a subscriber, so the guy who wrote it in the beginning is a subscriber. So, good. The good news is, subscriber who didn't get poetry, now you belong to a magazine, you'll get poems from people who write in the tradition. So this is sort of his third category, is the I guess contemporary traditional. We've used the term new formalist for a long time, and I know of almost nobody who likes that term, and I certainly can't think of anybody who writes poetry today who would claim it proudly. But I think, again, it's a very smart essay with a lot of really rich and strong stuff in it. I found myself stepping back from this categorization and wondering about how we experience poems. Again, I like that on Getting Poetry as the kind of the opening part of the starting place for this essay. He says, I don't get poetry. And not Adam Kirsch, the guy who writes in, whose question he's answering. And, that is still, I think, that gets to the marrow of what I worry about and wonder about. And it occurred to me that there are, poetry exists from generation to generation. As I've said it in other places, a collection of poems is just an absolutely ephemeral unit. There are people I know who really care about composing a whole collection and putting it in order, and it matters, and it's a theme, and it's a project, and I think that's mostly just nonsense. I think that the unit of poem that matters is the individual poem, and it's because when a poem survives, which is to say, it makes it from one period to another for people to read, and generally in an anthology or generally in some kind of collection, it survives on its own merit. It doesn't generally survive because of its neighbors in the collection in which it originally appeared. And this happens because somebody passes it along, shares it. So much of this shit takes place online now, so we think of reposting or resharing or however a poem. And I got to thinking that maybe rather than trying to divide poets into three categories, and there's a little bit of I think totally understandable, but a little bit of a snotty, or not snobbish impulse in slipping in this kind of traditionalist poet category. I found much more useful the following division, which is that there are three reasons that one might pass a poem along that I can think of. Certainly that maybe come up today, especially on the internet, which is where, again, so much of this takes place, for better or worse. The first and the most obvious is that you share a poem, you pass a poem along because it's by somebody you like or care about or have a relationship with. And that's fine. I don't think that's bad. I think that's true of every field. The second, and maybe this is sort of the thornier category, is you pass along a poem because you want to make a point. Either that poem makes that point very well, it's a piece of effective rhetoric, or something about the poem or the poet it proves you right, or proves you virtuous or good or in the know in some significant way. And then the third category is you pass along a poem because you liked it. You liked it. It made you feel something. It made you laugh. It made you cry. This is, by the way, a very good essay by David Yezi in the New Criterion about why poems are like jokes. This is from years ago. Definitely worth looking up. I'll try to put a link in if I can in the show notes. But these three categories: you share a poem because of the poet. You share it because you want to make a point, or you share it because you liked it. And then that third category, I actually include both, pop poetry, as Kirsch would put it, and art poetry, to use his distinction. I would include there Billie Eilish songs and Joshua Megan poems. Because I think that this is the key thing, that there's an immediate, and not purely immediate, but there is a genuine personal response. There's a pleasure in it. And this does, I think, where I think Adam Kirsch is really, really right on the money. You see it right in the subtitle of this essay, is On Deriving Pleasure from Poetry. He gets lost in the weeds a little bit, but this is I think, really the central question, is what is the pleasure we derive from poetry, and how do we derive more of it? And outside of that, poems that don't have any interest in that, maybe that's part of why our reviewer and my wife and I and all of our friends have gotten to have this this ennui. I don't know, but I want to end this first episode with a poem that I like, and I won't say a whole lot about it. I'll just read it for you because I think it's really fucking good. Let's go to that now. Okay, we're back. This is a poem by Fenton Johnson, whom I'd never heard of until I stumbled on this poem some months ago. I found out there is a Fenton Johnson who is a writer who is alive today. He's, I think, a professor in Arizona, and I'm sure a swell guy. This is a different Fenton Johnson. This Fenton Johnson's been dead for quite a while. He was associated with the Harlem Renaissance and preceded it, I think, slightly. But this is just a fucking terrific poem. All right, so the poem's called Tired. I may read it twice. We'll see. Tired by Fenton Johnson. I am tired of work. I am tired of building up somebody else's civilization. Let us take a rest, Melissy Jane. I will go down to the Last Chance Saloon, drink a gallon or two of gin, shoot a game or two of dice, and sleep the rest of the night on one of Mike's barrels. You will let the old shanty go to rot, the white people's clothes turn to dust, and the Calvary Baptist Church sink to the bottomless pit. You will spend your days forgetting you married me, and your nights hunting the warm gin Mike serves the ladies in the rear of the Last Chance Saloon. Throw the children into the river. Civilization has given us too many. It is better to die than it is to grow up and find out that you are colored. Pluck the stars out of the heavens. The stars mark our destiny. The stars marked my destiny. I am tired of civilization. God, that just kicks me in the stomach every time I read it. I mean, I think, not only do I read here, the where Auden got Funeral Blues from, but I also read here basically the entirety of Everett Maddox's career. And I like Everett Maddox. But the cleanness and simplicity and just absolute heart-crushing bleakness of this poem is hard to compare with anything else. I'm going to read it one more time because I'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of this guy. And I may be out of the loop, but I always like hearing a poem twice if I think it's any good, and it's a short one. So I'm going to read this and then say goodbye until I start doing this dumb shit again next week or so. All right, Tired by Fenton Johnson. I am tired of work. I am tired of building up somebody else's civilization. Let us take a rest, Melissy Jane. I will go down to the Last Chance Saloon, drink a gallon or two of gin, shoot a game or two of dice, and sleep the rest of the night on one of Mike's barrels. You will let the old shanty go to rot. The white people's clothes turn to dust, and the Calvary Baptist Church sink to the bottomless pit. You will spend your days forgetting you married me, and your nights hunting the warm gin Mike serves the ladies in the rear of the Last Chance Saloon. Throw the children into the river. Civilization has given us too many. It is better to die than it is to grow up and find out that you are colored. Pluck the stars out of the heavens. The stars mark our destiny. The stars marked my destiny. I am tired of civilization. Excuse me. Whew. God, that's a killer. All right, well, Slee Ricketts is a podcast that I'm trying to fucking piece together, and God knows whether it will survive. My wager with myself. So Stephen Hawking famously made a wager with Kip Thorne, whereby if the short version being, as I dumbly remember, that he was really invested in the idea that black holes were real, which they turned out to be. And the bet was if we get this proof that black holes are real, then I, Stephen Hawking, will buy you, Kip Thorne, a year subscription to Penthouse. Not because I want to do that, but because I will have some consolation if black holes turn out not to be real, and that I won't have to do this. So he was betting against his own interest as a hedge, as an insurance policy. And I feel like that's what I'm doing with this stupid fucking title for this podcast. So if this thing disappears, then I won't have to host a podcast called Slee Ricketts anymore. But at the moment I do. If you'd like to get in touch, you can write me at sleerickets@gmail.com. That's SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. Or just go to my webpage, which is matthewbuckley-smith.com, and that has a contact page there. Please do write if you have questions, suggestions for future topics or guests, or complaints, I suppose. I'll field those as well. Do rate highly, review well, and subscribe often on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever else I've managed to get this thing up. The show is produced in North Carolina, and the music comes courtesy of Eternal Producer. Thanks very much. Till next time.